There have been times throughout wrestling history when fans have been begging WWE to push someone. Names like Daniel Bryan, CM Punk, and more recently, LA Knight come to mind immediately. But sometimes the inverse happens in that a push occurs which audiences absolutely do not want to see. No, on occasion there have been times situations like this have been outright rejected by the fan base, often very vocally in fact. What are the biggest examples of this phenomenon? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Roman Reigns. Now, we all know that as things stand today, Roman Reigns managed to turn things around and become the biggest star in all of wrestling and beloved by fans. But things were not always so rosy for the tribal chief. No, well, he did get over as a member of The Shield when he, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose all debuted on the main roster back in 2012. Come the middle of the decade, a definite backlash was beginning to develop around the big dog. Why was this? Well, many felt that his mega push right up to the top of the card and position as the next face of the company in waiting were all a case of too much too soon for the Florida native. Sure, he was talented, no one was denying that, but there was a strong sense that he wasn't anywhere near ready enough for the spot he was being given yet. So when it became clear he was the guy then, fans began audibly rejecting Roman at shows, with the worst example of this probably coming at the 2015 Royal Rumble when, after winning the match and booking his ticket to the main event of WrestleMania 31, Reigns was aggressively booed out of the building. How would Vince McMahon combat this reaction to his next top guy? Would he bite the bullet and turn him heel as he'd done with his cousin The Rock in 1997? No, the boss was too stubborn for that by then. So instead, he dug his heels in and spent the next 5 years fighting their audience, continually pushing Roman as the top dog by giving him world title runs and WrestleMania main event spots, all while each step of the way fans let him know exactly how they felt. Truly, it was a surreal time to be a wrestling fan, as it felt like few fans were happy with the direction things were going in. So thank God in 2020 things were finally figured out when Reigns at last turned heel and found that missing part of the equation, with him at this point morphing into the megalomaniacal tribal chief, the man who would soon become the most over person in the whole of WWE. But what of the man we mentioned a moment ago, the cousin of Roman Reigns? After all, he went through an almost identical situation back during the 90s, didn't he? Well, yes he did. And that's why The Rock is our next subject. That's right, if you're a fan who only started watching post-Attitude Era, then it might seem crazy to think there was a time when fans viscerally hated Dwayne Johnson. But that was what befell a young Rocky Maivia after he made his WWF debut in 1996. Why was he hated so much back then? Well, it was at least partially because his character was so bland, was such a lifeless babyface, that it made it impossible for anyone to get behind him, especially in the burgeoning era of anti-heroes like Stone Cold Steve Austin. So because of this, despite Vince McMahon's desire to push Rocky as his next big blue chipper star, it wasn't long before fans were bringing signs to shows which read, "Die, Rocky, die." Thankfully then the boss would hear fan reactions eventually, and so it was that, like what happened with Roman Reigns in 2020, in late 1997 Rocky Maivia would formally turn heel when he joined the Nation of Domination. How would this work out for him? Better than even the most optimistic person could have hoped, because now that he was allowed to be that cocky bad guy which had always been locked away within him, Dwayne Johnson's superhuman levels of charisma quickly rose to the surface, and this made him get over as a heel in all the right ways. Hell, so over would he get that by the summer of 1998, WWF were forced to turn The Rock babyface again, with this being the spot they always wanted him to be in anyway. The only difference this time, though, was that he would no longer be playing the smiling, clean-cut hero. No, now he'd be the most electrifying man in sports entertainment, an anti-hero people's champion who was the only person that could compete with Steve Austin for the spot of biggest star in the company back at the turn of the millennium. Unfortunately, though, not every WWE star had a heel turn work out for them after their big babyface push had been rejected by fans. No, sometimes the damage was already done by the point this happened. And if you need a prime example of this, you only need to look at our next subject, Batista, and the time he made his return to WWE in 2014. Of course, if we're talking about that initial run Big Dave had back during the 2000s, then the fan reaction tells a very different story, as throughout this period, he was one of the most over people on the entire roster, at times the most over. But while being a big star in WWE might have been enough for some people, it was not enough for Batista, and so that was why, in 2010, after deciding he'd done everything he could in WWE, he left to go pursue a movie career. That's right, you may now know him from films such as Dune or the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. But all of that evidently wasn't enough to get rid of the wrestling bug for the DC native forever. And so that was why, in 2014, he'd make his return to the WWE, with the plan here being for him to triumphantly win that year's Royal Rumble and then go on to face Randy Orton at WrestleMania 30. The only problem with this plan, though, was back at that point in time, there was only one man WWE fans wanted to see on top, and his name was Daniel Bryan. Yes, this was right at the peak of the Yes movement, and so when Batista showed up at the Rumble and proceeded to crush fan dreams by winning it instead of the American Dragon, he was turned on in a big way. Of course, none of this was Big Dave's fault. No, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But regardless of that, the end result was the same, and the end result was every time Batista came out through the curtain, he'd be loudly rejected, with fans at one point taking to chanting "Bootista" whenever he arrived. Hell, there was even a night when he showed up to the ring in blue gear, causing the audience to hilariously yell "Bluetista" at him. Needless to say then, a heel turn would be imminent for the former WWE champion, but unluckily for him, this wouldn't be enough to turn fan sentiment on the situation around. And so, seeing the writing on the wall, it was only a few months later in June of that year that Dave decided enough was enough and that he was going to leave the WWE again in order to return to the world of Hollywood. But what of another main event figure of the Ruthless Aggression era? Someone who actually came out of that same legendary Ohio Valley wrestling class as Batista did back in 2002. Well, he also found himself being rejected later on in his career when he became a part-time champion. Who are we talking about here? Why, Brock Lesnar, of course. Now again, like with Batista, if we're talking about Brock's initial run in WWE, then there was no such fan backlash. No, back during the early to mid-2000s, he was hugely over, to the point where it truly felt like he was going to be the next face of the company for a while. Hell, even when he left WWE and returned again in 2012 after having conquered the UFC Octagon, he was still treated like a superstar, even if he was part-time in his appearances by now. Where the situation really turned sour for the South Dakota native, however, was when he won the WWE title from John Cena in the summer of 2014, as that was the point it began to feel like he was holding the belt hostage. Why was this? Well, because he was rarely on the show, and this meant Raw felt way less important as a result. Sure, Brock would eventually drop the title to Seth Rollins at WrestleMania 31, and this went some way towards rehabbing his image in fans' eyes, but even then, the same problems would arise over and over again when, over the years which followed, he'd win the world title multiple more times, and each time he did, we'd find ourselves in the exact same situation again. It didn't matter if it was his runs with the Universal title in 2017, 2018, and 2019, or his further spells as WWE champion in 2019 and 2022, every time Brock got a hold of the belt during his second run, you could almost hear the crowd groan because they knew we were now going to be in for several months of having an absentee champion. And all of this arguably reached its climax in 2019 when he absolutely squashed fan-favorite champ Kofi Kingston in just 8 seconds. Sure, it wasn't Brock who had booked things to be that way. No, that would be Vince McMahon. But by then, fans seemed to personally blame Brock to some degree for Kofi being jobbed out in such a manner. But what about our next subject? Someone who will be returning to WWE in the new year in order to begin his retirement tour. Someone who also had a tough time with fans rejecting his push over the years. None other than John Cena. Now, with him being an elder statesman of WWE and probably the biggest star they've had on their roster since the Attitude Era, there aren't a lot of people looking to boo John Cena anymore. No, if anything, he's now reached that status of grizzled old legend who fans are just happy to see whenever he turns up. But things weren't always that way for him. In fact, when he first rose to the top of the WWE during the mid-2000s, there was quite a backlash against him. Sure, he would get over during his very early days as the Doctor of Thugonomics, a cocky white boy rapper who first captured the hearts of fans at the dawn of the Ruthless Aggression era. But once he was elevated to the point of face of the company and instead transformed into more of a Hulk Hogan-esque all-American hero, that audience reaction started to turn sour at record speed. Why was this? Well, as it turns out, the adults in the audience didn't want Pig Match John to be a cheesy good guy. No, they wanted the rebellious figure they'd first fallen in love with prior to that. That said, at least the younger fans loved this new version of John Cena. And so it was then that over the next decade or so, we'd see a constant war playing out with live crowds as the kids regularly cheered on their hero, all while the adults booed him out of the building in favor of other stars like CM Punk. Would WWE have an issue with these reactions the champ was getting? Evidently not, as they never seriously considered the idea of turning John heel throughout his entire run. Obviously then, this only served to further fuel the detractors of the West Newbury native, and because of that, it took until the mid-2010s before a critical re-evaluation of Cena saw him finally start to get over with adult fans again. But even if this was the case, it could never take away from the fact that for so long, John was the absolute antithesis of what they wanted to see on top of the wrestling world. A cartoonish figure, pretty much the exact opposite of someone like a Stone Cold Steve Austin. Of course, John Cena wouldn't be the first top babyface to be rejected by fans of WWE though. No, years prior to that, during the early 80s, this would happen with an altogether different star, one who goes by the name of Bob Backlund. That's right, we're going back to 1982, right around the time Vince McMahon Jr. was taking over the reins of the WWF from his father. And given this was before the rise of people like Hulk Hogan, the WWF was a very different place. Sure, you still had larger-than-life figures and the focus was always less on old-school wrestling and more on entertainment, but the idea of the sports entertainment spectacular that Vince Jr. would soon create hadn't fully coagulated yet. Needless to say then, this created a problem as fans of the company once known as WWF were starting to tire of their top babyface. Why was that? Well, because he didn't exactly have the flair needed to lead WWF into this new era of glitz and glamour. No, well, Bob Backlund was a very good wrestler, good enough to have held the WWF World title for the better part of 5 years between 1978 and 1983, he wasn't the kind of person filled to the brim with charisma. And in the early 80s, what fans up north were starting to look for increasingly was someone who had charisma above all else. So when Hulk Hogan came along at this point, it only shone a greater light on the fact that Backlund's time in the spotlight was coming to an end, with fans rejecting him in greater numbers each and every week. In fact, so bad would things get for the Minnesotan, in 1983 he was voted as the most overrated wrestler of the year by fans of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Obviously then, no matter how many great performances he put on throughout this period, with him defending his title against the likes of Adrian Adonis, Cowboy Bob Orton, Sergeant Slaughter, and even Superfly Jimmy Snuka, there was just no turning things around, as his act was just way too out of date for this new generation of fans. How would things end for Bob then? Well, to the surprise of no one, on December 6th of 1983, he dropped the WWF title to the Iron Sheik, with this allowing Hulk Hogan to then beat the Sheik for that same belt just a few days later. And after that, now feeling like a man very much out of time with what the audience was looking for, Backlund would disappear from the WWF, with him entering semi-retirement and not being seen again on any regular basis until 1992. But it's not always about the guys when it comes to a push that gets rejected by fans. No, from time to time the same thing has happened with the ladies too. And a prime example of this can be found in the case of our next subject, Charlotte Flair, and her unwanted rise to the top in 2019. Now, Charlotte Flair was at the top of the WWE Women's Division long before this. Hell, she arrived on the main roster like a bomb in July of 2015, and from there proceeded to become an instant face of the women's revolution. And throughout that period, while there were a few who felt she was being given additional opportunities on account of who her dad was, there weren't many who were going to deny her talent, with this generally being accepted as the real reason she was in the spot she was in. As time went on though, and Charlotte began to get the Roman Reigns treatment, being pushed at the expense of other women, that fan sentiment began to change, with this all reaching its peak in 2019. What happened in 2019 to cause things to boil over? Well, Becky Lynch happened. Yes, it was in the summer of 2018 that the Irish woman got hugely over with her The Man character, so much so that she briefly became the biggest star in all of WWE. And that looked like it was setting up a big-time WrestleMania main event for 2019, one which would be the first ever women's closer, and one which would pit Becky as the Steve Austin-esque anti-hero babyface going up against former UFC bantamweight champion turned pro wrestler, the baddest woman on the planet, Ronda Rousey. The only problem with this, though, was that, if rumors are to be believed, Charlotte Flair had been promised the WrestleMania match against Rousey long before Lynch ever caught fire. And when the idea that this was going to be the main event began to take shape, she really didn't want to give up such a spot. So because of this, Charlotte was shoehorned into the bout, turning it into a triple threat in the process. Yes, the whole thing felt forced, as the natural match that most fans wanted to see was the one-on-one showdown between Lynch and Rousey. Yes, it would have been like if at WrestleMania 14, WWF had forced Triple H into the Steve Austin-Shawn Michaels match. But even if it wasn't what most fans wanted, Charlotte still got the spot. Still, even if the daughter of the Nature Boy is one of the biggest heels the women's division has seen, she was never booed quite so much by fans as our next subject was, Eva Marie. Of course, if Eva Marie had come around during a different era, say the Attitude Era for example, then she might have been received better by audiences, as at this point in time, being good in the ring wasn't all that important. Hell, even in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the time when the Divas era was in full swing, she could have had a better time in the company. By the time she joined WWE in the 2010s, though, fans had started to get used to a better in-ring product from the women, and whenever Eva Marie appeared on TV, she would either be booed or, even worse, get no reaction at all. After all, this was the beginning of the period where the women would be given time to wrestle. So because of that, Eva Marie felt like a greater relic of a past era. So much so that by the time 2015 came around, she'd be sent to NXT to improve in the ring. Unfortunately, though, Eva never got to the level of other performers at the time, and this only made the fan rejection of her all that much worse. And this fan rejection would carry on no matter how much the company tried to push her during the rest of this run, or during her second run in the WWE between 2020 and 2021. But even Eva Marie may not have been the most pushed star fans rejected the most during the 2010s. No, there's another who arguably trumps even her. That's right, it's time for us to pivot back over to the men again as we talk about the modern-day Maharaja, Jinder Mahal. Yes, Jinder Mahal may have been a solid wrestler, but one thing he wasn't ready for at this time was to be a main event star. No, like many other wrestlers who came before him and many more who will come after him, he was very much a mid-card talent, someone who could work with other, more focused upon names and usually put them over. Sadly though, no one told WWE this, as in 2017, they made the decision to not only push Jinder all the way to the main event scene, but to give him a run with the WWE title. That's right, despite at this point being long slotted into the role of glorified jobber, it was in the spring of that year that the WWE gave the world title to the Canadian, as in a matter of weeks we got Jinder going from doing absolutely nothing in the undercard to challenging and defeating Randy Orton for the WWE title. Needless to say, fans were not happy with such a move. Seriously, it was difficult to take Jinder seriously as a world champion at that point, as he'd never been presented as being on this level for the entirety of his career. So even when subsequent defenses of the title saw him get the better of names like Shinsuke Nakamura, few fans in the audience were into what was happening. And they were only too happy to let the company know this by either booing at the champ or simply not responding to him at all. Yes, it really was a shame Mahal got caught in the crossfire here, as he did nothing wrong. He was only doing what he was booked to do, and who in the right mind would turn down a run with the WWE title? But that doesn't change the fact that he would bear the brunt of fan resentment during this period, and so when he eventually lost the belt to AJ Styles on the November 7th episode of SmackDown that year, there was no way he was going to remain in the main event spot. No, once his title run ended, Jinder would return to the mid-card, with him never even getting another real shot at the top level again. Luckily though, not everyone whose push was rejected by fans suffered this same fate. No, some managed to turn things around and get over before all was said and done. And if you want a perfect example of this, you need look only to our next subject, Dominik Mysterio. Yes, well, he may be one of the most over heels in WWE today, someone who regularly gets nuclear heat whenever he comes through the curtain. Fans were not always booing Dirty Dom in a loving way as part of the show. No, while now it's very much a part of the fun to jeer him, back when he first made his debut in 2019, the heat he got was a lot closer to real-life heat, as people genuinely didn't want to see him on their TVs. Why was this? Well, because back in 2019, the son of the legendary Rey Mysterio was nowhere near ready for the big time. And when this perceived lack of ability was combined with the general fan sentiment that he was in the spot he was in because of who his dad was, it spelled disaster for the San Diego native in terms of getting the people on his side. Yes, if you go back and watch some episodes of Raw from this time period, then you'll see a crowd who just weren't invested in what Dominik was giving them. And this led to some pretty awful reactions for the second generation star. Even when he was teamed up with Ray Ray, in fact, it wasn't enough to get him over. No, all it did was make fans dislike him all the more as they felt he was bringing the former WWE champion down. Thankfully though, as we mentioned a moment ago, things would eventually turn around for Dominik, and the way he was able to turn things around was by fully leaning into the fan hatred of him by becoming the biggest sleazebag in all of WWE, Dirty Dom. That's right, it was in 2022 that, after turning heel on his dad and joining up with his mommy Rhea Ripley in the Judgment Day, Dominik Mysterio finally tapped into something special as he truly got over for the first time in his career. Not that this meant fans would be cheering him, of course. No, they'd still be booing him, but now it felt a lot more like they were having fun booing him rather than just being turned off by him as they had been before. Thank God that happened then, because for a while there it really did look like the Californian was going to be a historic flop with crowds, someone on the level of a David Sammartino or Garrett Bischoff. But then we guess it's just a testament to his ability that he avoided this and managed to go down as someone who won't be remembered forever for being a performer whose big push was rejected by fans.